I never thought a folding table full of canned soup and outgrown winter coats would end with my own brother standing in my driveway with his hand resting near his radio, looking at me like he couldn't decide whether to hug me or write me up. But that's exactly where I ended up, 6 weeks after I put my dad's old pickup truck in my driveway and turned it into a free food stand on the same street where I lived my entire adult life, surrounded by neighbors I thought I knew. It started small. My dad used to drive around our old neighborhood every Sunday with a truck bed full of bread, eggs, and whatever he picked up that week, just handing food to whoever needed it, no questions asked. When he passed in March, I didn't know what to do with that truck. Selling it felt like selling him, so I parked it at the end of my driveway, propped a hand-painted sign on the hood that said, "Take what you need, leave what you can," and stocked it with canned goods, bread, and the kind of pantry staples that disappear fast at the end of the month when paychecks run thin. By the second week, people were showing up before I'd even finished restocking. Mr. Alvarez, a widower 3 doors down who'd served 2 tours and lived on a fixed income that barely covered his medication, started walking over every Tuesday like clockwork. Renee, a single mom raising 2 boys on a waitress's tips, would slip by after her shift, always apologizing, like she was committing a crime just by taking a box of pasta. I watched my dad's truck become something bigger than either of us, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt like grief had a place to go. Denise Pruitt lived 2 houses up and sat on our HOA board, and she was the first person to corner me about it, standing at the edge of my lawn with her arms crossed like she was guarding a border. She told me the truck was an eyesore, that strangers wandering the cul-de-sac at all hours made the neighborhood look unsafe, that property values were the only thing standing between us and becoming one of those streets. I wanted to hate her for it, but the truth is, she wasn't wrong that some neighbors were nervous, and she said it with the kind of certainty people have when they genuinely believe they're protecting something. I told her I wasn't taking the truck down. She told me I'd regret that. For a while, it was just tension. Denise started a thread in the neighborhood group page, calling the pantry a magnet for outsiders, and a few neighbors I'd waved to for a decade suddenly stopped waving back. But I noticed something strange, too. Cans kept disappearing from the truck overnight, way more than the daytime visitors could account for. And one night, my motion light caught a figure crouched at the tailgate at 2 in the morning. It was Phil Granger, who sat on the HOA board right alongside Denise and had spent the last meeting nodding along with every word she said about outsiders lowering the neighborhood standards. Phil had been laid off 4 months earlier and hadn't told a soul, not even his own wife, and he begged me not to say anything. I didn't. But I started wondering how many of the people loudest about the pantry were quietly grateful it existed. Things escalated fast after that. Denise brought a formal complaint to the board, demanding I remove what she called an unpermitted structure, even though I'd never charged a dime for anything in that truck. A man named Greg Dunmore, who lived behind me and had been fighting with me for 2 years over a property line dispute involving his driveway, suddenly became Denise's loudest supporter, showing up to every conversation, backing her up with claims about crime and clutter he clearly pulled from nowhere. At the time, I thought he just agreed with her. I didn't realize yet that Greg needed the board distracted and angry at me specifically, because if everyone spent their energy fighting about my truck, nobody would notice him quietly filing paperwork to claim part of the shared easement between our properties for his own driveway. Then Denise's son Tyler, 16, and usually glued to his phone, got caught by his mother taking 2 grocery bags from the truck late on a Sunday. Denise found out at the worst possible moment, in front of 3 other neighbors. And her reaction wasn't anger, it was panic, the kind of panic that comes from a memory you've spent years trying to bury. Tyler finally admitted the food wasn't for us, it was for his friend Marcus, whose family had been sleeping in their car for 2 weeks after an eviction nobody on our street knew about. Denise went pale and walked away without saying a word, and I didn't understand why until later. That same week, she filed a complaint with the police, claiming visitors to the pantry were loitering and creating a disturbance late at night, the kind of complaint that gets someone sent out fast. I was restocking the truck around 8 in the evening when the patrol car pulled up, lights off, and the officer who stepped out was my brother, Eli. We hadn't spoken in 3 years, not since the fight at our father's funeral over what to do with his truck and his tools, a fight that ended with Eli telling me I cared more about being the good son than about actually grieving like a normal person. Seeing him in uniform, walking up my own driveway because a neighbor had reported me, was somehow worse than the silence had been. He didn't smile. He asked me, professionally, almost like a stranger, what was going on. And I could see him fighting to keep his voice level because the truck behind me, with Dad's faded paint job and the dent from the time Dad backed it into the mailbox, was sitting there right between us. Denise came outside the second she saw the patrol car, practically gleeful, telling Eli this was exactly the disturbance she'd been complaining about for weeks. Eli looked at the quiet street, the empty truck bed, Mr. Alvarez's porch light across the road, and asked her what specifically she was reporting at that exact moment. She stammered. There was nothing happening. There never really had been. And that's when Greg, standing nearby with his arms crossed, made the mistake of saying loudly that the real problem was people like me turning the neighborhood into a personal charity project. And Eli, who'd spent the last 4 years working patrol in neighborhoods a lot poorer than ours, asked Greg what exactly he meant by people like me. Greg didn't have an answer that didn't make him sound exactly like what he was.
Word got around fast that the officer who responded was my own brother, and within a day, Denise had flipped the story entirely, telling anyone who listened that the police hadn't acted because of family favoritism, that I'd basically called in a personal favor. Eli heard about it and showed up at my door that night, furious, not at Denise, but at me, convinced I'd somehow used him without asking. We had to fight we'd needed to have for 3 years, loud and ugly, right there on the porch, finally saying out loud everything about Dad's funeral, the truck, the guilt, the distance, until we were both too exhausted to keep yelling and just sat down on the steps instead. What actually broke the whole thing open wasn't a hearing or a letter, it was Denise herself. 2 days later, at a community cookout nobody expected her to attend, she found out from another board member that Greg's driveway paperwork had quietly gone through while everyone was busy fighting about my pantry, and that the property line he'd been chasing for 2 years ran straight through the easement she'd personally argued to protect years earlier, back when her own family had nearly lost their house to a developer's land grab before any of us had moved onto the street. That was the piece nobody knew. Denise hadn't just been protecting property values. She'd once been the family parked outside a food bank in a borrowed car, ashamed and certain everyone was judging her. And somewhere along the way, she decided the only way to never feel that small again was to make sure her street looked like the kind of place that helped, never the kind of place that needed. She walked over to my driveway that evening in front of half the cul-de-sac and didn't apologize with some polished speech. She just said she'd been wrong, that she'd been so scared of looking poor again that she turned into the kind of person who punished other people for being poor, and that Tyler had been more honest with her in one conversation than she'd been with herself in 20 years. Then she asked, quietly, if Marcus's family could get added to whatever list I kept for deliveries, because she'd rather be the woman who fixed it than the one who watched it fall apart. Eli stood at the edge of the driveway that night too, off duty, no uniform, just my brother again. And when Mr. Alvarez came by for his Tuesday box and shook both our hands like he'd known us our whole lives, Eli finally looked at the truck the way I think Dad would have wanted, not as a ding we fought over, but as the only piece of him that ever really needed saving. We didn't fix 3 years of silence in one night, but we started, right there, next to a truck full of canned soup and the kind of forgiveness neither of us thought we still had a room for.